Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 708th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Esther McGowan and Ted Kerr. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Ted Rees here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual and necessary decolonial work, but they serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land from which we are speaking. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Esther McGowan is the Executive Director of Visual Aids and was Associate Director from 2012 to 2017. She has worked as a fundraiser, administrator, and grantmaker with a variety of arts organizations over 3 decades, including the Bronx Museum of the Arts, Watermill Center, and Arts International, among others. And Ted Kerr is a writer and organizer. He is a founding member of What Would an HIV Doula Do? And he just co-authored and released a book called We Are Having This Conversation Now, The Times of AIDS Cultural Production. And we are so, so grateful to have these 2 amazing activists and scholars here with us today. I'm a huge fan of both of you, so I'm so excited to turn it over to you, Ted, to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much to the Brooklyn Rail and to you, Eleanor and Chloe. This is such a pleasure. And part of what makes this a pleasure is getting to do it with Esther. On social media, I joked it's Thursday afternoon live with Esther and Ted. Should we
could start? That's a good idea, Ted. Let's talk after this. I think that's a podcast of the future.
I think so. Should we name our past histories so people know that our connection is not just instantaneous, that it's been built over the years? How would you say we know each other?
We know each other because we work together at Visual Aids. So Ted is a great person to be in conversation with about Visual Aids because Ted knows the organization from the inside and also views it from the outside as a contemporary AIDS activist. So couldn't be anyone better. And you were actually formative. We can talk about this maybe when the conversation officially gets going, but you were formative in my learning about the contemporary issues of HIV and AIDS when I started at Visual Aids in 2012, because I came from an arts background, not an AIDS background. And I had a lot of imposter syndrome. I was, very aware that I didn't know a lot and you knew so much. And so I remember you gave me a Greg Bordowitz book at one point and really, were someone who was there to really help me learn what I need to learn. So yes.
Amazing. That's so generous of you. And actually, that's a really good place to start. What I like to do in moments like this is just to let the audience know who and how we show up in this space. So Esther, I'd love to ask you first, and I'll answer it after you, is what is your relationship to HIV/AIDS?
So my relationship to HIV and AIDS goes pretty much throughout my entire adult life, but only in the last 10 years at Visual Aids have I really been immersed in the topics and have really known a lot of people living with HIV and really thought about the history of HIV and AIDS, the history of activism and contemporary issues. Because, back in the day, the AIDS crisis started when I was in high school. Of course, everyone knew what it was. It was something that you were afraid of, but it also felt like it wasn't really your problem when you were a high school student. And I was in Baltimore. I grew up in Baltimore. I knew people who passed away, actually, even when I was in high school. Older adults that I knew from different, my weekend job and things like that, were passing away, but it wasn't really my top thought or my biggest fear or what I thought about all the time by any means. And when I moved to New York, I always think about this now, being so immersed in the history of HIV and AIDS and activism, is when I moved to New York in 86 and then was here from 86 to 90 and then came back to New York in 93, I wasn't really thinking about AIDS and AIDS activism. I mean, it was such a huge part of what was happening in the city, in the East Village where I lived. But I was into art, visual art, which is part of my connection to visual AIDS. And, I was a rock and roll girl and I was a goth. And so that was my life in New York, was sort of, rock and roll and art. And I wasn't thinking about AIDS and HIV. And the other thing that's fascinating now when I think about it is one of my early jobs in 1995, I got a job working for Art Matters, the Art Matters Foundation, which is a wonderful foundation that still exists. They just announced their current grants yesterday, and they're wonderful. And I worked for them for 1 year, and we shared an office space. It was a loft, and we shared it with visual aids and creative time. We all were together in this one loft. And so I actually met the first director of visual aids, Patrick O'Connell. I met the second director, Nick Debs. I was aware a little bit of what was going on with visual aids because we were just sharing space together, but I didn't really even then think about it as much as I should have probably. So my strongest connection to HIV and AIDS started in 2012 when I got the job at Visual AIDS, and I had come from a lot of different arts-based jobs. And I had quit my most recent job, and I really wanted something that had meaning. And I wasn't sure what that was or what that meant to me, but I knew I needed to have a job that felt meaningful. And when I saw a listing on NYFA for the associate director job at Visual AIDS, that just was clear. I just said, that's my job. And fortunately, everyone else agreed with me. It was my job and I got hired, and I've been here for 10 years. And it's also the longest time I've ever been in one job. And I think that says a lot about visual aids and the culture here, but also the importance of having a job that feels meaningful, because it definitely changes how you feel every day at the office.
I want to just name the beautiful vulnerability you've already shared, talking specifically about your relationship to HIV in the early days. There's a way in which we're supposed to create this narrative where especially if you were in New York at that time, that it just swept you up. And, I was a young person in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and as a gay cis male, HIV was constantly being projected onto me. And so I was thinking about it all the time. And often when we look back at historical footage, it looks like the whole city of New York was immersed in this conversation. And I think it's actually really important to say, no, that's not true. Some people were, and they couldn't not be. And then there was other people for whom there was other priorities too. There was other catastrophes going on, other narratives that were being shaped. And so thank you for that. It actually is really important to put that on the historical record.
And I also think, it depends on what group you were in too, like who you identified with, then AIDS felt more or less about you. And I think I was in groups where it didn't feel like it was about me. Of course it was about all of us. And the other thing that I always look back on now too, that's interesting, is I was working in a store in 1996, 97, and my coworker was HIV positive. And I remember the moment when he was able to take heart. And I remember us talking about it and this idea that he wasn't going to die. And it was this really big moment. And I think about that now as we talk about, through my work at Visual AIDS, the history of HIV and what happened in 96 and how it changed everything. Because that was a personal moment for me, someone I knew, was going to not die. And it was really interesting. He was a very young person too, so.
I love that story. And for me, I'll answer the question now, what is my relationship to HIV? It was post 1996. And like I said, it was being projected onto me. And I lived in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is a big Canadian northern-ish city. And I wanted to feel part of the globe, and I wanted to understand what it was to be part of a queer community. And so HIV/AIDS brought the world and my identity into kind of one thing. And also at that point, I started to get involved in AIDS service organizations, and a lot of the people who look like me and have my identity, that is to say a gay white dude, had left the service organizations because they had medication. And so they could kind of move on from the activism, some of them, and move on from the community because they had their health and they could kind of resume normal life. And who was left of the AIDS service organizations were, people who injected drugs, sex workers, newcomers to Canada, people from the Indigenous communities. And it was this first lesson for me for coalition building and intersectionality. And so that has been my experience of HIV ever since, including my time at Visual AIDS, because obviously we know art brings people together.
Yeah, and I also always think of you, Ted, as someone who was focused on HIV and AIDS activism at a time, and almost an in-between time, when there weren't a lot of people engaging in the activism who weren't necessarily, because of what we're talking about with the heart cocktail, with medications, it fell off the radar of many people as an important issue. AIDS in Africa became a bigger issue, for example, for activism. Not that it shouldn't have been, but it also superseded people's thoughts about HIV in the US and other places. And so I think, Ted, you're kind of at the forefront of a really important activist moment where people didn't let it be forgotten. And we're really, getting in everyone's face about what these issues are. And then you were able to segue now into a time where activism is much more, activism is almost a really interesting part of pop culture now in a way that it wasn't for a long time. And so thinking about someone like you who kept it going when it wasn't something everyone was interested in, and really made sure it didn't fall away.
I want to touch on a lot of what you just said later in the conversation, but there's something super important that I want to talk about right now, and it's kind of the other kind of grounding force in our oh wait, we have beautiful visuals. Should we take a pause to look at some of these historic images of visual aids?
Sure, and I can just give a little quick overview. You're going to see some historic images of Visual AIDS projects. Visual AIDS was founded in '88. The first big project was Day Without Art in '89, which is still going on to this day. We've done it every year. We just did it last week, the 2022 version. And originally it was about taking art off the wall, asking major art institutions to do something that represented the loss in the art world of the AIDS crisis at the time. The death of artists like Keith Haring, Robert Mapplethorpe, and many people that you haven't heard of were passing. And so this is an example of what a museum did. And this is something that we did more recently, which we projected on the outside of the Guggenheim, an artwork by, and I should say this is by Kay Rosen. I did not put that in the description at the bottom. This is an artwork by the artist Kay Rosen that she did for Visual AIDS in 2013. We actually created it and put it on an activist tote bag. We have been known for the last few years for our activist tote bags, and that was something Kay, who's been a big supporter of Visual AIDS, designed. That was a rogue projection that was not sanctioned by the Guggenheim, and we projected some contemporary images and topics on the outside of the Guggenheim, the Met, and other institutions that year. Keep going. I feel like I'm getting immersed in talking about these. This is an example of how Day Without Art has changed. We segued from the idea of loss and mourning to the idea of what is happening in contemporary HIV and AIDS culture now, and how can we share that with the world. So we started commissioning videos and films from artists and activists. So this is something we did in 2018, where we asked multiple activist organizations that are doing really exciting grassroots work to make films. You can go to the next one. This is going back in time. This is something in 1990 called Night Without Light, in which, this is astonishing, the entire New York City skyline turned its lights off in honor of the AIDS pandemic and the loss in New York City of the AIDS crisis at that time. And even people like Donald Trump and other folks sanctioned their buildings having the lights turned off. This is a really interesting project from 1990 called Electric Blanket. It was the artists Nan Golden, Frank Franca, and Alan Frame created a 3 carousel slideshow that was about, it showed artist work, but it also contained important information and statistics about the AIDS crisis at the time. And that is something in our history. Visual AIDS has been known for making activist broadsheets. The tote bags I mentioned are the contemporary way we do that. This is back in the day, this is 92. On the left is a Barbara Kruger image. On the right is John Giorno. These are 2 separate activist artworks that were made. And what's really interesting is at the time, the early 90s, artists were asked to make something that would be black and white and 8.5 by 11, so they could actually be photocopied and shared literally like on a photocopier. And the story is that people who were part of visual aids knew people who worked at Kinko's overnight on the night shift, and they would go in on the night shift and make tons of free copies of these and hand them out. This is this is a poster. So for Day Without Art, for many years after the advent of the heart cocktail, so at the time when there was medication and AIDS was beginning to be forgotten, visual aids made activist posters. So this is one of my favorites, which says AIDS is over, right? And then it tells you have to read the fine print, which tells you that AIDS is not over. And this is a wonderful artwork. It was done as a sticker. I don't know the age of everyone in the audience. This may not mean anything. This was what Visa, if a store took Visa, they would put a sticker in the window, and where it says AIDS here, it would say Visa. And this is an artist representation of the idea of kind of AIDS Inc. Later, another interesting issue that once there were medications, then it became about pharmaceuticals and money. And there were a lot of issues for people living with HIV around what does it mean that pharmaceuticals are now making a lot of money off of people living with HIV. So that references that, and it was created as an activist sticker. And then one of the things that people don't know about visual aids is that we actually created the red ribbon. Meaning, like whenever you see a logo, an event, a nonprofit that has anything to do with AIDS and HIV, there's the red ribbon. And that was actually created by the Artist Caucus of Visual Aids. And you can see them here sitting around a table, actually making the first red ribbons. They thought of, an idea to what could symbolize kind of allyship and support of those living with HIV and AIDS that could be really simple. And they came up with the red ribbon, which is now ubiquitous. And visual aids does not make money from this. It was put into the public domain. So when you see a red ribbon, it's not like visual aids is getting $1 million from it. I wish we were, but we're not. So yeah, visual aids created the red ribbon in 1991. And then one of our biggest and most important projects is our archive. It's founded by the artist Frank Moore, who passed away in 2001, I want to say. And Frank was concerned in the 80s and 90s as people passed away, as artists passed away. A lot of people passing away very young, didn't have wills, didn't have estates. You don't think about that when you're 26 or 30 years old. When you walk down the street, the height of the early AIDS crisis, for example, like in the East Village in New York, if you walk down a block, you would see someone's entire life put out on the curb for the garbage. And that usually meant the person had died of AIDS. And so one of the things that he noticed is that if someone was an artist, all their artwork would be out there. And so he came up with this idea to save images of artists' work for posterity in an archive. And the only criteria for being in the Visual AIDS Archive Project is that you were making art and living with HIV or had passed away. There's no adjudication. That's not like, you have to have an MFA or be shown in a museum. Anyone making art is welcome. And that archive exists to this day. It's the only archive of its kind. It's incredible. It's an incredible place to discover artists you've never heard of who are absolutely brilliant. I'm actually sitting in the archive room. Visual Aids just recently, last year, moved into a much bigger office space, which is a big deal for us. We were in a tiny office for many years, and we now have a room for our archive, and that some people can come and study. So anyone who's listening and watching today, if you're interested in learning more about the Visual Aids Archive, you can go online to visualaids.org and look at it online, but you can also come to our office in Chelsea and actually look through the physical archive, which is slides, as you're seeing. And this is an example of the online registry, which shows how it looks online. You can click through, and artists can actually upload their work themselves. So it really transforms our ability to reach out to artists all over the world. And this is just an example. We do a lot of public events, all different kinds of public events. When Ted worked at Visual Aids, that was Ted's job to put our public events together. And this is an example of something we did a few years ago at the Whitney Museum when it first opened in its new location. One of our artist members, meaning an artist living with HIV, who is in our archive, Rafael Sanchez, did a talk about his very good friend, Mark Morrisroe, who died of AIDS at the Whitney Museum. So this is sort of here to represent all the different types of public events that Visual Aids does throughout the year. This is an example of contemporary activist broadsheets. We showed the pieces that were John Giorno, black and white, to be handed out as sheets of paper in the early days of the AIDS crisis. This is something we've done recently, Play Smart Safer Sex kits. We get artists to design what become images on essentially like a trading card, like a baseball card almost. And the information on the back is about HIV and AIDS, safer sex practices, things you need to know, health-related topics. And then the front of the image, the front of the card is an interesting artist designed image. So this is one we did in 2016. This whole set was about women and HIV. So you're seeing a combination of women living with HIV are here, women who have a relationship to HIV and AIDS in different ways. And then the back of the cards feature HIV information, safer sex information, reproductive rights information. That was a great project. Something else we're doing, in our contemporary work, one of the key groups is women living with HIV. They're a group that is very marginalized in terms of healthcare, the way that HIV and AIDS is talked about, what people know about HIV and AIDS. There's a lot of stigma still for women living with HIV. So we started a couple projects. Love Positive Women is one of them. We work with artists all over the world to make Valentines that are then sent to women living with HIV around the world. And we have another project. So you're seeing, we actually partner with Do Do, which is a paper making artist workshop, now located in Brooklyn. And the women and the people in our group, artists and women living with HIV, actually learn to make paper. So you're seeing women on the left actually making paper from pulp and then making Valentines, which are then mailed to women all over the world living with HIV. This is also an example of a contemporary broadsheet. When I became executive director, I joined Visual Aids in 2012. When I became executive director in 2017, I was interested in reinvigorating our activist work because Trump had just gotten elected the year before. It felt like a time as an activist organization with this incredible activist roots, and we knew some of the greatest activists of all time, felt like we should try to explore activism again. And so we worked with Abram Finkelstein. Abram is from the Silence Equals Death Project and Grand Fury. Abram is the person who created, along with his collective, Silence Equals Death, probably the most important artist-based image of AIDS activism. And so we worked with Abram to think about, what is the contemporary Silence Equals Death? What is the topic now that people should know about? And we came up with this broadsheet about HIV criminalization. We actually marched in the Pride March for the first time in like 20 years with this campaign, and that was great. And then this is something that, this is a project by Nayland Blake, an amazing artist who's actually on our board now. And this was done as a sticker. And then you're also seeing all of these buttons. Another way that we carry out activism is we have made buttons. These are not our buttons, but buttons are also part of visual aids activism. And this was in here, this is created, Nelson Santos, who you see in the caption, was the executive director before me, and was the executive director and was at Visual Aids for 17 years before I joined, and I worked with it as well.
Yeah, actually, can we stop this slideshow? This is my book, and we don't have to talk about that right now.
But let's show people the cute picture though, Ted. The next one was,
oh yeah, great.
Yeah,
Let's do
so
that.
This is just a cute, I want to show everyone, this is Ted and I when we first worked together. This was at a visual aids benefit that we do every year called Postcards from the Edge, which is this really fun art sale. It's actually coming up January 5th through the 8th, mark your calendars. But this was 10 years ago when Ted and I were working together. So just wanted to share like our cute 10 years younger selves.
When we were even younger babies, we're still babies. So actually, before we lose the momentum, I just want to underscore what an impressive body of work for any organization to be doing so many different things with so many different people, often people who are, well, by nature of the work, dealing with a chronic health illness, who are often marginalized because of their race, because of their gender, because of their ability, and doing it on so many different scales, from the intimate workshops to the big guerrilla takeovers of museums. Like, I just don't think in terms of American activism history, in terms of world art history, that we can underscore how important and how impressive visual aids is. And I say that as somebody who's been inside the organization, outside the organization, and this is my pivot, as somebody who always actually has an uncomfortable relationship with art in relationship to AIDS and activism. So the next question I want to ask is, what is our relationship to art? I know for me, one of the reasons I left visual aids is that I felt that art was becoming, at least for me, a too narrow of an aperture in which to do the work I wanted to do. So I went to seminary because I wanted to study the language of radical Christianity, thinking about how the churches often could be a conversation that we could have in terms of HIV/AIDS, and how often we ignore the good stuff that the church has done, or we don't factor in that it is a complex place. We create space for nuance when it comes to art, but not for other parts when it comes to HIV. I've since, I have a more healthy relationship to art now. I'm someone who participates in it. But Esther, I would love to know, as somebody who is also living in late stage capitalism, as somebody who's also had to fundraise for amazing organizations and maybe organizations that you felt apathetic about or ambiguous about, what is the role of art in social change for you as the ED of visual aids?
That's a really important question in our mission and in the way that we talk about the organization. Because first of all, the pairing of art and HIV and AIDS makes us unique in the way in which we exist and the way that our mission straddles those two things. And what we say, there are two ways of looking at it. And we kind of create programming from both of those directions. So there is first of all, the use of art in activism. So when you think about Silence Equals Death, you look at the piece that John Giorno made for us that we showed. You think about the piece about criminalization that we showed. The reason those things are powerful is because an artist made them, and they knew how to attract the eye, to take a message and make it visual in a way that makes it effective activism. So art is one of the most effective tools in activism, I would say, and we can see that, and when we think about contemporary activism, also that's not necessarily AIDS activism, Black Lives Matter, and other form of environmental activism. You think about the images that you see, and that's really powerful. So then there's the aspect of art as a healing tool. So that's another way in which art fits into the HIV and AIDS landscape. And this is a way in which we think about, we work with, our archive is for artists living with HIV or those who passed away. We have, have a grant program called the Materials Grant Program, which provides gift cards for artists to buy art making supplies. So if people, because they are on SSI income because of their health or for other reasons, also during COVID, when people lost their employment, to be able to make art, if you're someone who's passionate about art, to be able to make art is actually a really healing process. And so we facilitate all the ways in which those living with HIV can make art. And so what's interesting is you have a real range of folks as well. You have people who are PhDs, who have MFAs, who are shown in museums and galleries. And then you have folks who just want to make art because they love to do it. And we serve all of those communities. And so one of the new things that we're doing, we have something called Women's Empowerment Art Therapy Workshop, which is part of the work I mentioned about, really looking at how can we support women living with HIV now. And so the idea of the Women's Empowerment Workshop was someone who was part of Love Positive Women, the Valentine Workshop, a woman named Shirlene Cooper, who's a lifetime incredible AIDS activist, sort of a powerhouse person. And she said, like, why do we just have to do this once a year? I want to make art all the time. What can I do? So she got a materials grant, which is, to get art supplies. And she invited women to come to her home and make art with the art supplies she got from her materials grant from Visual AIDS. And she started talking to me about it. And she was like, more and more women are coming. They can't all fit in my apartment. What can we do? And so I worked with her to make this become a program of Visual AIDS. So now we cap it at 30 women each time because it's an art making workshop, but we have hundreds of women who are part of it throughout the year. And so women living with HIV are brought, now we have an incredible range of museum partners. So what women are able to do, and these are women who, for the most part, have never made art and haven't really thought about art in their lives. Art is not the top topic or interest for many of the people in the art therapy workshop. It wasn't, now it is, because they've been in this workshop. But so we were able to get outside of traditional HIV and AIDS spaces and go to art spaces and bring the women every month to organizations like Recess, Mokata, and also the Brooklyn Museum, the New Museum, MoMA, PS1, major museums. And the women, what we try to do is have them take a tour of one of the exhibitions at the beginning. And then we have an art making project that's led by one of our staff members who's an arts educator, Blake Pascal. And, the power of making art in terms of empowerment is really, really strong. And what's really fun is to see women who, what always happens in these situations is the person who comes and says, oh, I'm going to be terrible. I've never done a painting in my life. I'm not going to do it. They sit down. They're the one who makes the most amazing artwork. And then they're coming back the next month. So art as a healing tool is also a way in which art segues into the HIV and AIDS narrative.
Yeah, I love
that was a long answer, sorry.
I mean, but it ends in such a really important place, which is to talk about, you named the really important things that art provides, the visual language for our movements, and art can be a healing tool. And then I think what you're also talking about, or what I'm hearing you say that's really important, is that art is a way of life. Art is a way of finding voice. Art is a way of making community. Art is a different way to interact with our beliefs and our faith and our community. So what Shirlene and Visual AIDS have done together is also created another space for, as you said, women who are too often marginalized in the conversation of HIV/AIDS to gather, to, you said, empowered, but also to just talk to each other. We know that the history of HIV/AIDS is about people who are marginalized from the community having to find each other to say, what does it mean to have a yeast infection if the doctor doesn't believe that's related to HIV? Or can I breastfeed? Or what does it mean when I'm the only woman at the protest, right? These are valid questions. And I just think that's super important and something that visual aids is so good at. And the thing that I love that about visual aids, and I almost, because this is a conversation, I think it's okay to bring it up. One of the things that I've often struggled with in terms of HIV in the art world is this thing that happens in a very small percentage of conversations is when we say, oh, this artist died young, imagine what they could have created. It's both a beautiful memorial, but it's also, it reeks of capitalism and speculative markets to me. And I'm just wondering, as someone who really is engaged in helping people think about how do we honor the dead, how do we honor careers that have been cut short, how do you make sense of conversations like that?
Well, I think it's interesting. That's a multifaceted question. I think one of the things that we struggle with sometimes, but I think we're also able to achieve, is to not disregard our history. I mean, one of the things that happens in some HIV and AIDS conversations is to somehow want to make it be historic, to say, oh, the AIDS crisis was something that happened and now it's over. Let's take a look at it. You know, there was a famous situation a few years ago at the New York Historical Society. The Historical Society did an exhibition about the AIDS crisis in New York. And it basically, if you didn't know anything about the AIDS crisis, you would have thought it was something that ended in 1996. And so we want to forefront and think about contemporary issues. And, you know, our sort of tagline is AIDS is not over. You know, we try to put that in a lot of what we do. Say it, print it on things, because that is something we want everyone to remember. But then you also don't want to forget the history. And I think that anyone who's doing activist work now is standing on the shoulders of all the people that did it over the years, many of whom have passed away, and many of whom didn't live to see the results. You know, AIDS activism is one of the most successful activism moments that's ever happened. If you think about the results that it got. It literally got results that saved people's lives. And but not everyone who was out there protesting was able to live to see the result. So when we think about artists, yes, I mean, the art market is a fraught topic. And there are certainly artists who have passed away who were not, someone who did well and were beginning to make money and be successful in their lifetime, like David Wojnarowicz. I mean, he was starting, but it wasn't the way it is now in terms of what his work would fetch at auction. You know, Keith Haring is someone who was very successful in his lifetime. Then there are other folks who have been sort of discovered after they passed away. Sometimes people are discovered now. And this is actually an interesting segue into thinking about the value and importance of the visual aids archive, because what is happening, and we're seeing it a lot in recent years, is that artists, living artists who are not artists who have followed a professional career track, but who are brilliant, are being discovered by galleries and museums. A couple of examples of that, an artist named Frederick Weston, who was one of our very favorite people at Visual Aids, an absolute genius, and was finally, sadly died of cancer a few years ago, but was able to really see a huge success in his professional work as an artist towards the end of his life. A wonderful artist named Joyce McDonald, who makes her art at home, you know, and does these incredible sculptures, is self-taught, and an absolute genius. And she is also someone who's discovered through visual aids and now has gallery representation. But then you also see, you know, people who passed away who at the time were not appreciated, who now are. You know, there's an artist named Hugh Steers. I mean, Hugh, one of the things that's interesting too is the art world and the ways in which the medium in which you make art makes you popular or not popular at a certain time. So we're seeing now artists who at the time when they were alive, for example, were doing figurative painting at a time when that was not in vogue in the art world. And so there are artists who passed away in the early 90s who are now being discovered by galleries, sometimes through the visual aids archive, sometimes in other ways. and now we're in a moment where figurative painting is something everyone loves and is interested in. And so they're being discovered. And yeah, in some cases, you hope the family is involved, or the person's partner, the loved ones are somehow involved in the discovery and the way in which the person's legacy is stewarded. That doesn't always happen. I'm going to do a little plug for something. We just recently released this book on the artist Daryl Ellis, and it's for sale at visualaids.org. And one of the amazing things, when we talk about legacy and someone who didn't achieve success in their lifetime, but now, in the way that we look at art now, is obviously an absolute genius and everyone's so excited, is Daryl. Daryl died in '92, right on the cusp of early success. And another artist who we talked about him earlier, his name is Alan Frame. He was part of the early days of visual aids, part of creating the Red Ribbon. Alan knew Daryl and knew that Daryl was a genius, and actually kept all of Daryl's artwork in a storage locker in the Bronx for 40 years, literally 40 years, until Visual Aids made a book, which came out 2 years ago. And now there is a retrospective at the Baltimore Museum of Art. It's going to travel to the Bronx Museum. All of the major museums are buying Daryl's work. He has a gallery representation, incredible gallerist named Candace Mady, who, and his family, his brothers and sisters, are very much involved in all of this. And I was actually just with them in Baltimore at the opening of the exhibition. So that's what, in terms of the art market, late stage capitalism, what does it mean when someone, especially someone who passed away, is all of a sudden making a lot of money for someone? One of the things that we look to is if the family, if the people who love that person, who were there at the time, are somehow part of it, it definitely has a different feeling.
It's such a beautiful and full answer, and it suggests to me tons of behind the scenes intimate conversation with families and with the staff. And I just think that is part of what it means to be within the visual aids community, is to take none of this for granted and to be thinking seriously about all of this. And one of the many things that you just said that I really loved is the way that what's hot or what's not in the art world changes. And another thing that we've both seen in our lifetime with visual aids and with HIV AIDS in general is the way that stigma has changed and the role that artists and visual communicators have been such a big part of that. I remember when I was still at Visual Aids, it was really hard to get younger people with an HIV diagnosis to sign up. We had so many powerhouses of earlier generations who were part of the registry and were so meaningfully involved, but it was really hard to get anyone under 40 to sign up. And that, I remember that shift, and that shift changed for many reasons, in part because of our hard work, in a large part because the archive went online. So that meant it was more accessible to young people who think about their work in a digital format. We also think about the rise of U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. That was a game changer in how people thought about themselves as people living with HIV and others. And then of course, PrEP, which is a fraught conversation, definitely changed how people thought about HIV. So those are some of the big things. I want to say intimately, it was also individual artists. So someone like Keila Beja, her first time that she did something as an artist was with Visual Aids. And she said that she was going to change how people visually thought about HIV, and she did that. She did that through her self-representation photographs. She did that through her performance. I think about Benjamin Fredrickson, a photographer. I remember when he signed up, I was elated because he was somebody that I felt like we were courting for a long time. And he's someone whose work was rooted in 21st century sexuality, and he was someone living with HIV. And to have those together were so wonderful. And then of course, most recently, I'm thinking about Clifford Prince King, whose film is part of the Day Without Art, but who's reminding us that intimacy can be tender, intimacy can be about identity, but it doesn't have to be connected to that. And so I just want to also say that part of what makes visual aids amazing is not only how you negotiate the art market and death, but also how you make space for the living and all the different things that we as living people bring up. Is it stat time, or do you want to say something about that before I bring in some stats?
I just wanted to make one comment based on what you were just saying, is that the important thing to always remember is that someone's HIV status is personal to them, and not everyone is comfortable sharing it, and that's their right. And that because HIV and AIDS has changed, there are more people who are comfortable sharing their status, but not everyone is. And so that's something in this field you have to be very aware of. Even something simple like someone comes to an event, you want to put it on Instagram, you have to think, like, is everyone whose face is in this picture okay with being linked to an organization called Visual AIDS? Because it has meaning, in multiple ways. And so we're always conscious of that. And another thing that we haven't talked about just really quickly, which I think has changed some people's perspectives, is COVID. The idea of what it means to be ill, what it means to live through a pandemic, is something that now touches every single person in the entire world, which changes many people's perspectives about what it means to share that you are ill or have an illness. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about now. Also, when you think about HIV and AIDS too, is that there are two simultaneous pandemics. Actually, there are more than two, but these are the two we're going to talk about. And a long-term HIV survivor who's had HIV for 40 years is now living through two pandemics at the same time. Tony Fauci, who was the face of the early AIDS, he was the face of bad government in many ways in the early days of the AIDS pandemic, now had become the face of COVID in a very different way, like the positive, sane voice in the COVID conversations. And that was very triggering to a lot of people living with HIV, because, it was like it was all of a sudden 1991 again. And there's Tony Fauci on the news talking to you about, how to stay safe and all of these things, which were very, very much like the early days of the AIDS pandemic. But the difference is, because it's something that affects literally everyone in the entire world, the stigma is totally different, totally different.
Yeah, I think bringing that connection is so important, because it's also the thing that Visual AIDS has done well. And I think even if I think about the collective I'm a part of, what would an HIV doula do? What we've tried to do is say, like, this can be the beginning of a conversation, not the end, right? Like, what does it mean to live with illness? Good question. And what does it mean to live with an illness that is fatal if it's not treated, versus COVID, which is still horrible, and long haul is real and it's no treat. But I think even most long haulers will tell you that it's different than HIV. And there is stigmas, and the stigmas are different. They're not even competing, they're just different, right? And I think that art and culture is a place where we can have those conversations, and they don't have to fight for headline space. They can actually like swim together in the beautiful nuance, which Visual AIDS makes space for.
And also, to sort of edit myself, something I just said, it's HIV does affect everyone in the entire world. It's the perception, though. It's the perception that it's somehow other, or for having to do with other people. Whereas COVID, the perception is that it's about everyone. And so the difference in, we always talk here about, the vaccine in 1 year. Imagine if there had been a vaccine in 1 year at the beginning of the AIDS pandemic. I mean, it's just such a different, such a different thing.
I mean, again, Esther, I love what you just said. I often feel compelled to say that HIV affects everyone, because on some level that's profoundly true. And then one thing in the last few years that I've started teaching about HIV/AIDS is something I say at the end of the semester is, if you walk away and you never think about HIV specifically again, that's okay, as long as you promise me you're going to think about structural inequality, as long as you're going to think about racism and misogyny and transphobia, and how not having universal health care impacts people's life chances in the United States. Because in a way, if you're thinking about those things, you will eventually get to HIV/AIDS. But if you don't start with HIV, that's okay, as long as you're kind of thinking in coalition. And so I wrestle with that. I sometimes I'll tell people what I do, and depending on their age or their life, they don't know about HIV. They don't care. And I used to get mad and think that was a failure, but I wonder, what are people's reactions when you tell them that you're the ED of visual aids?
I think, well, it depends on the person, the age. A lot of what's exciting is that I do think that our contemporary work is really getting noticed. And so I do, and from people who are in the field, a lot of the kind of very well-known activists from the early days of ACT UP and folks that are kind of legendary will complement our contemporary work. And that's so incredibly meaningful. It's kind of mind-blowing. And I am really proud of what we're doing now. And I think that I also think we've been really good at keeping the legacy alive. We have a very young staff, not me, but the staff is very young, 30 years old and under. But the ways in which we're seeing young people who care about this legacy and who care about this history is really powerful. So I think that a lot of older people in our community are very moved and very relieved to know that there's a group of young people that want to keep this legacy alive and are very passionate about this work.
And do you ever have people that don't understand your job or wonder what's the point? Like, do you encounter people?
Sure. Depending on who I'm talking to, you always get people who say, "Oh, is AIDS still a thing?" That happens a lot, in different groups and different communities. We did an exhibition a couple of years ago, must have been before COVID, at La Mama, which is their exhibition space on Great Jones Street, and I was manning the gallery. And this kid, I don't know, teenager, I guess, kept going by on a skateboard in front of the window. And finally he came in and he said, "What is this exhibition about?" So I explained to him, and he said, "Oh, I didn't know that AIDS still existed." He was maybe 17, 18. That's always an interesting conversation to have. And, you try to just let people know. And well, you're about to give the stats, so we're going to let everyone know.
I also want to say that that's been the existential issue with HIV, not only dealing with a fatal illness, but the kind of always fear that people will stop paying attention to HIV. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, HIV is first recognized in 1981. Already by 85, which is less than 4 years into the pandemic, which is almost what we're at with COVID, there was large-scale memorials being created, and large-scale memorials that were active, which meant it wasn't about just memorializing, it was about doing an active thing to say that people are dying and the crisis is still going on, right? And even 1988, there's a sticker that says, AIDS is not over, by this small collective called Little Elvis. And, so the whole kind of experience of HIV has been dealing with people's apathy, dealing with silence, dealing with ambivalence. And we've both talked about how even us as deeply committed people, you yourself who was in New York during the crisis years, your engagement was limited. My frustration with art sometimes takes me away. And so there's a way in which Visual Aids as an organization, outside of you as the amazing executive director or me as somebody who participates, is the thing that has been the heartbeat for making sure that people think about HIV/AIDS in a visual way. And in the book that Alex Juhasz and I write, we talk about the second silence. So there's these periods where people just stop paying attention to HIV/AIDS, largely mass media. And one of the most intense was something that you alluded to earlier, 96, the arrival of medication. The mass media kind of just decided that AIDS was no longer a topic, in part because death is an easier topic to discuss. And once people weren't dying, AIDS was too hard of a story to cover, but also because a lot of the people whose lives were being saved were white and middle class, and everybody else was still struggling in complex ways. And it was during that time that I think Visual Aids, who's always been doing good work, did some of their most profound work under Barbara Hunt, under Amy Sadao, under Nelson Santos, and then under you. You really came in at a time where you had to navigate the period of silence to the period of deep engagement, to everybody and their dog wanted to say something about HIV/AIDS. And I wonder, how do you navigate people's excitement about something that you've been now committed to for over a decade professionally?
I think it makes the work feel it makes it feel like a success in a sense. And just to sort of acknowledge my own part in this, when I joined Visualize in 2012, we were really moving into this time of greater interest in activism and greater interest in activism on the part of young people. So I wasn't really trying to lead the organization when it was so difficult. And that was really Amy and Nelson and Barbara Hunt before them. And, trying to do an activism project when people didn't understand why this was something that needed activism, trying to raise money for a nonprofit that was doing something that people didn't understand why it was even a thing anymore. And so, but, as I was kind of imparting before, when you now see everything swinging back, you think about social media, video, the use of video again, activism, which harkens back to the early days of public access video, but now we have TikTok and Instagram and the ways in which video is being shared. And we just get a lot of young people who come to research in our archive. We get classes coming to learn about visual aids. So that just feels like it's all the work is worth it, because you have to have a younger generation who's going to carry the work forward and care. And I feel like we're at a moment where there are a lot of young people. And I think it's because activism is such a part of popular culture, but there's so many things that you need to be activist about. The environment, Black Lives Matter. I mean, there are all of these issues that are so pressing for young people, and they won't have a planet or a democracy or whatever it is if they don't do something. So
the stats that we've been promising, I can't believe that we're teasing people with stats, but here we are. As of 2020, there were over 30,000 new diagnoses in the US of people living with HIV. Currently, there's over 1.2 million people living with HIV in the US, which I think is, something we take for granted. You and I both know lots of people living with HIV because of our work, but if I think about my friends in other cities, that might not be true for them, and so I'm wondering for you, when you hear this number, 1.2 million, what does that bring anything up for you? Does that make you think about
I
the
think
work you have to do?
that many people do know people living with HIV. They just don't know it. I mean, they don't realize it. I think that that's, a big topic to discuss. And I think, as we were mentioning before, stigma, I think in a city like New York, there in many ways is less stigma for different reasons. But if you're in a small town, if you're somewhere else, if you're in the South, you're not necessarily sharing your status. If you're a teacher, we get some folks who don't want their status on the web because even though they're open about it, they don't want the students of their class to Google them and have that be the first thing they see, and that's a very real fear that people have, not because they're ashamed, but because, they could, depending on where they are, it could become an issue and they could lose their job. So I think that, it's a huge number, and it is, again, because of medications, also for many people, it's also not a visible illness on their body the way it used to be. At certain points in the height of the AIDS crisis, people maintain their health in different ways. Not everyone does, but many people can. So it's not like someone walks in and you think, oh, they have AIDS, because you're looking at them. So I think that there's just a lot of deeper issues in the ways in which people share their status, the way that people live. And just to also double down on the fact that there are many different ways in which people live with HIV, and some people can be healthy and maintain careers and go to work and aren't sharing their status in ways that is visible or obvious, but then there are many folks who have many illnesses, who are not healthy. People also have comorbidities. We're finding a lot of older folks who've been on HIV medications since 1996, who, for example, are getting liver cancer because they've been taking pills every day of their life for 40 years. And so there are many, many different ways in which people are living with HIV, and there's not one description of how someone is living. It's very, very broad ranging. And also you can't be sure, one of the things we always are aware of with the folks in our community is we don't necessarily know what's going on with them and in terms of their health, how they're feeling, and especially with the COVID pandemic, when people were isolated and had other health concerns, and had been living with HIV. It's there's a lot happening for people in terms of their health and mental health too, because of what's been going on in the last 5 years. Has it been? I don't know. It seems like it's 5 years. Is it 5 years? 4 years?
Right, 5 years and 45 years, right?
Yes,
like
right.
I think
Yes,
about
exactly.
if, we know people in the community who have been living with HIV for more than 40 years. And some of them, maybe by the grace of hardworking activism, means that they have stable housing because of HASA or something like that. But what that means is they're often living in neighborhoods that have gentrified around them. And so they might have stable housing, but they live in a community where they are literally not seen, or people want them out and they're trying to actively push them out too, right? And so everything that we've seen horrible happen in the last 5 years has just been kind of the intensification of what our good friend Ronald Reagan and his friends started. I say that sarcastically in case anyone's reading the captions. The powerful thing about your mic drop, Esther, where you said that people just don't know that they're living with people with HIV, that reminds me of how often it's easier to talk about someone's HIV status once they have died, and how that is always such a complex thing, right? People are allowed to disclose or not disclose as they wish. No one is owed anyone's health information. So I just want to say that. What I also want to say is that I wish we lived in a world where we could have faith that people's disclosure or not disclosure was based in their agency and not in the fear of criminalization, or not based in fear of losing their housing or their loved one or their job or the next art show that they want, right? And I'm thinking a lot about Beyonce and Renaissance, and how that whole album in many ways owes
You did it, Ted. You brought in one of the ladies of pop. This is Ted.
But it's so true, right? Like, she has dedicated to her uncle who was living with HIV, who was really such a supporter of her. So when you hear Renaissance, you are hearing HIV past, present, and future, right? You're really hearing the legacy of somebody who is living with this illness that we're still grappling with. And I think that's something that Visual AIDS does a really good job of. You can't really imagine culture in the US and not think of the braid that HIV brings into it. And so the last stat I kind of want to bring into the conversation before I give you the last word is currently 38.4 million people are living with HIV worldwide. 40 million people have died with HIV since we started keeping track. And why I want to end with this is that so often we think about HIV in regards to death and who we've lost, and that's powerful, and we should, and Visual AIDS does a good job at that. At the same time, we have to remember that visual AIDS is also an illness of the living and the making and the creating and the agitating and the sexing and the loving and the being intimate. And also Visual AIDS does such a good job at that. And so I just want to throw you the final word, and just, is there anything that you want to say about that? Or what's one thing you want people to know about the work?
Well, a segue from what you were just saying and the stats is something I do want to talk about as something in our contemporary work. Is we're doing a lot of work internationally. The most recent, I guess the last 2 Day Without Arts, in which we commissioned people to make films, we worked with international artists. And one of the things to remember is we are in a US centric and often a New York centric worldview of HIV and AIDS. And the reality for people around the world is very different. And so if you go to video.visualaids.org, you can see all of the videos we commissioned, but the most recent group are from artists all over the world, a few artists in the US, but artists in Korea, artists in Canada, artists in Mexico, Argentina, and the issues that they face, because, for example, medications are very different. So in Mexico, we've had 2 different films that are amazing, looking at issues that people living with HIV in Mexico have, because the corrupt nature of Mexican government has resulted in the purchase of only the cheapest HIV medications for people, and also then a lack of it. So it's hard to get it at all. And then when you do get it, it's not the best. In other Jaundice, for example, there's a film in this particular series of films about the fact that because of the less than amazing medications that people have access to, they can develop jaundice. And that's an issue for young people living with HIV, all people living with HIV, but young people in specific nations where that is the medicine they can get. So there are just so many issues beyond the US that, and I encourage people to think about those and learn about them. And also, one of the things they're talking about HIV status and people sharing their status, all of the artists that created films this year are people living with HIV who are very bravely, out about their status and have made these films, who are showing you what their life is, what are some of the issues in their life, relationships, relationship status, medication. So the Being and Belonging Day Without Art series, which we just debuted last week at the Whitney Museum, and they're now online and everyone can watch, is a really good way to kind of get an overview of the ways in which HIV affects the lives of people living around the world. The end. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Esther. Thank you so much, Ted. This has been
Yeah, thank you, Ted. Your questions, as always, are amazing.
Yeah, it's been such a generous conversation. I'm so grateful to both of you. We've got a couple questions. So I want to ask a question to both of you. So how have the goals of visual aids changed over time, like at different points of the epidemic? And I want to ask that same question to you, Ted, in terms of your research and your teaching.
I can start. I think that the goals have changed as the pandemic has changed. In some ways, the goals are the same. But some of the things that Ted and I were discussing in terms of silences, and Ted referenced a second silence, which was in the mid-2000s. But the first silence that Ted's referencing is the Reagan administration. In the beginning of the AIDS crisis, the Reagan administration never talked about it, wouldn't say the word, never. And that was considered to be the sort of first silence that a lot of the activist groups were formed to fight against. And so I think, early days, a lot of activism work was about trying to save lives. It's about getting the information out. There's an urgency. People are dying, and a lot of the activists themselves are dying. So there was this intense urgency. Like if you see Larry Kramer and some of the speeches he was making, like the level of emotion and urgency and terror and like anger was very different. And then as after the advent of medications in '96, it became about how do you share the fact that AIDS is not over, and that was very difficult. And as Ted referenced, in those years, and then it also becomes about supporting people living with HIV and looking at contemporary issues, doing beyond just doing activism projects, creating programming, books. We also published a lot of different types of books. The Daryl Ellis monograph that I held up, we create artist monographs, but we also have a series called Duets, which is two people in conversation. And there are a lot of different ways that visual aids has created access to hearing from people living with HIV, and so that some of the contemporary issues can be shared and understood, and then also engaging in activism still around some of those issues. So I think, the mission in many ways is the same, but I think the methodology, and there are different urgencies. There was like a very extreme urgency around drugs into bodies and people not dying in the early days. And then the urgency became about, don't forget, it's not over, don't forget. And then the urgency now is about contemporary issues like criminalization, and also thinking about some of the healthcare issues that I was mentioning too, about comorbidities. Long-term HIV survivors are passing away, often not directly as a result of HIV, but as a result of long-term survival or even old age. So wanting to make sure we're preserving those legacies. We actually just started an oral history project, which is two of our artist members in conversation with each other on film. And that is part of a current focus that we have on making sure we capture stories of people in their lives now, because we don't know how long people will be around.
Esther, you did such a good job of answering for an organization. I luckily only have to answer for myself this question. And I would say, you know, I definitely came of pleasure-seeking age in the second silence. So my early goals was just to get people to talk about HIV/AIDS, just to be with me in community, to talk about this thing that I was told I should be afraid of, that for better or for worse, I wasn't afraid of, or I didn't have it wasn't that I was only afraid, I learned to not be afraid. And then people started to talk about HIV in a big way starting in 2012, but it was so historic looking. It was looking back, and at first with such a narrow gaze. It was just looking at kind of like this small patch of amazing work that people in major cities in the US did. And so my goal became to not only think about HIV pre-1981, so I do a lot of work looking at the story of Robert Rayford, who was a 16-year-old in St. Louis who died in 1969 with HIV. And I work deeply with people in St. Louis, including Lois Conley at the Griot Museum of Black History, to think about how do we tell Robert's story in a way that's responsible, in a way that is first and foremost coming from St. Louis. And because Robert and his family are Black people from St. Louis, what does it mean to tell that story in that community first and let it radiate out from there? And what impact will it have on people living with HIV in St. Louis? We don't want to make Robert into the next patient zero. That was a myth, and we know that HIV entered the US many times before people started to pay attention in 1981. And so that leads to kind of my ultimate goal, which is to be nimble in what we know about HIV, to always be not letting any information calcify. Of course, we want to keep our safer sex knowledge kind of in place, but not even. I want to keep everything nimble so that we're not kind of taking anything for granted. And then the last thing I would say is my goals have increasingly become about focusing on people living with HIV. So I'm an HIV negative person, and I take up a lot of space in this conversation. So the very least I can do is to be making sure that every time we talk about PrEP, we're actually talking about all the people who knew for a long time that if they were on their medication, that was what was best for them, right? So I always want to be centering the things that people living with HIV know about their lives, and how if we support them knowing what they know, the world is better for everybody.
Thank you so much to both of you for those really amazing answers. We have another question from Chloe, and also if anyone else decides that they want to ask a question, you can feel free to raise your hand on Zoom or send a message.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ted and Esther, for that incredible conversation. It was so generous, and I really, really enjoyed hearing about all the work at Visual AIDS. The work at Visual AIDS, I loved hearing you, Esther, speak to how it's become increasingly global, but also how it is ultimately about living and about right now in life. And I know, I think those of us who work in organizations in the arts know that that feeling of being able to feel like you're contributing to social life and change comes from like the smallest, simplest of experiences or circumstances that happen on the day-to-day. And so my question's somewhat mushy, but like, is there a specific memory that you'd be willing to share with us of like a moment where you were doing something with visual aids and you felt the impact of the work so directly?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. And I think, some programs have a more direct, obvious impact, thinking about the Valentine program and the Women's Empowerment Program that we've been doing for women. That's a program where you see the direct impact as it's happening, which is really powerful. And, getting thank you letters from a woman in Ukraine, like holding up her Valentine and saying, oh my God, this is amazing, is really powerful. I think there are, I don't know, visual aids is a place where there are many moments that are meaningful, which I think is one of the things that's so powerful about the organization and about working here. And I think I will say, you know, something that was amazing was I had been associate director for 5 years, and then I was promoted, and then it was announced. And one of the first things that happened was the first executive director, Patrick O'Connell, called me, and he said, I know you're going to do a great job. And that was amazing because he passed away a couple of years ago and was a long-term HIV survivor. He was leading the organization at the height of the early days of the AIDS crisis, when it was, you know, so dramatic and so intense. So that is something that sticks in my mind. You know, there's a legacy here of people. I think as an activist organization, you know, you have a legacy of people who just kind of lead the best way they can based on what's happening at the time. And everyone's a different kind of leader, but there's definitely a feeling of this kind of chain of people that are somehow connected. So.
I will just briefly say, when I worked at Visual Aids, sometimes we would do presentations at local high schools, and and I was doing a presentation for a really like sweet and informed group of high schoolers in the Chelsea neighborhood. And I can't remember what the prompt was, but I was like, you know, what, I kind of got frustrated, and I said, like, what would make you engage in HIV more? And this very precocious, he looked to be 7 or 8, but he was in high school, so he must have been older than that. He made a sticky note and it said, make AIDS funny. And so that's been a really meaningful thing for me, is to remember that even though there might be deep intensity in this conversation, one way that we reach people is through different registers, and humor is one of them. And some of the laughs that I've had in the Visual Aids office and outside of the Visual Aids office with people like Fred and Joyce has actually been what's fueled me, the information, but also the love and the humor.
And some of the films that we commission are funny, you know, and that's always an interesting thing. And it's also great in when you have like 6 films together in a program, and some of them are very intense, you all of a sudden have one that's funny, and it's okay to laugh. You know, we have this incredible film by Brontes Purnell, which is hilarious. And from his perspective as someone living with HIV, and we've had other films as well. And yeah, it's like humor is, you know, art is powerful, but humor is also powerful. But of course, with humor has to come respect for the subject matter in a very deep way. And I think humor also needs to come from someone with a lived experience. And, you know, it's so, but yes, humor is an interesting moment always.
Thank you both so much for those answers.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Chloe. That was so great. I think Fawn wanted to jump in here as well.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Ted. That was great. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you.
I'm super happy that our friend Amy did her good service prior to go to Philadelphia to take that job at the ICA. She's in fact with Suzette Ming, was the guest critic at the Rail last summer during the intense, you know, anti-Asian, you know, sort of frenziness and whatnot. But let me ask you this, because Ted raised something very interesting about the mainstream media, the way it generates, you know, which I can't help but thinking of that famous photograph by Teresa Frare of David Kirby. And that was in 1990. I mean, I remember it came out. You know, these are kind of thing that make you super perplexed, you know, because not that dissimilar to our friend, the great artist Alfredo Jarre, who did this incredible installation almost like an homage, because he's obsessed with photojournalism. And when Anthony Carter, that South African journalist who commits suicide, you remember, after having won the Pulitzer Prize, of that very haunting photograph of the little child, Sudanese girl, thrown into the food hole. Behind her is looming over a huge bird. Remember that? So the criticism can be very devastating, but we need those images to inform us the devastation of such horror. So I'm sort of caught up in between, So I wonder, how do you guys deal with that? The vulture was so intense behind that little girl, no more, no less than the nakedness of it all. From David Kirby, Last Minute of Breath,
And yeah, and there's also the famous image of Felix Parts when he passed away, and that was part of intentional activism. It was his wish, and his wish to be shown on his deathbed in a billboard. In the way that was done. That wasn't done by someone else. That was his dying wish, was to use the image of his dying body in AIDS activism. Or if you think about a lot of the folks who had the public funerals, the activist funerals in which their body was carried through the streets, their dead body was literally carried through the streets. That's incredible. You can't do better than that as getting in someone's face and making them understand the reality. So those were really powerful moments, and some of the sort of harshness of those images came from all of the intensity of that time. People were terrified, people were angry. They didn't have a limit in their mind on what they needed to do, what was appropriate. It's like, well, everyone's dying. Like we have to do whatever we can do to make people understand. It's interesting. And it also brings up, kind of the reverse of that. You have the intense images that are based in reality, but then you have those confusing moments in pop culture where AIDS is a topic in a film like Dallas Buyers Club. You have right now the new season of American Horror Story. Thinking, what does that mean? How do you think about that when you are a person who is living with HIV or a person who is deeply involved in AIDS activism? How do you deal with those moments, which can be very confusing if someone brings it up at the Thanksgiving dinner table and you try to explain why that's not, not the way to think about it. So yeah, it's interesting. And there are moments also in popular culture where AIDS is more of a constant subject of movies, plays, TV shows. It kind of swings in popularity back and forth, I think.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, there was such controversy about those early photos, People with AIDS by Nixon, that were on display at MoMA that caused such controversy. And a lot of ACT UP members at the time were really against it and they protested it. And then if you talk to some of those same people now, they understand that those photos, regardless of how they might have thought about them in the past, transmitted the urgency of the illness to people who maybe weren't seeing it or feeling it the viscerally same way that people who were seeing it on their streets were. And then I would say about the David Kirby photo, so I've written about it, I just put the chat there. That photo is endlessly important for all the reasons that you already brought up, but also there's a hand in that photograph that belongs to a very important person who often gets written out of the story of that photo. And that is Peta, who is David Kirby's friend, who helped negotiate that photo taking place and who is living with HIV, and who is just an amazing person who reminds us that too often Indigenous people, Black people, and people of color, people of trans experience, people of diverse gender experiences are often written out of the story of HIV/AIDS. And it wasn't Teresa Frere's, she didn't do that, but that is something that happens. And so I think looking at that photo more carefully explores how intense HIV continues to be in the world.
Yeah, and for all the similar reason that we need to mobilize this activism, same way that we're doing here, just because we realize that Silicon Valley people have no historical knowledge, and they really just put it out there with their technological availability as a form of exploitation. And I realized that we need to bring greater warmth and know how to use images for the betterment of our need to communicate, because I know that for fact when the US bombed Baghdad, for example, it was then that no more close-up photographs were allowed to be taken. It has to be from a distance. And it was a certain kind of political, I would say, censorship, because they knew that when the war in Vietnam, just based on a few images where the little young woman run away from napalm bomb, whose clothes were burned. You remember that was 1972? Yeah, Eddie Adams, took that photo. It was very intense, and it caused a lot of, protests in America, across the country, not to mention the, Kent State shooting with Mary Vecchio, who hovered over her friend who she got shot. You remember? So these are images, you're absolutely right, that help to retain and also part of the memory. Not to mention that it could happen now in our own activism. We need to do that more and more. Yeah, so I think it's any way that we can collaborate in the near future. I think the Rail will be super happy and thrilled to find a way to, cross-pollinate our ideas.
Well, that also brings me to a topic that I just wanted to throw out here too about images. We live in an image saturated culture now.
Mm-hmm.
And the images that you're talking about, Phong, were at a time when there were fewer images. And so those images were even more powerful because you weren't saturated 24 hours a day with images. So there's a question too about, because of social media, what is the impact of images now? And how do you create a form of activism that is powerful in that way when people are so oversaturated with images and information and everything? How do you stand out in a crowd and make your voice heard and create an image that's so powerful that it stands out from all of that? It's an interesting challenge now, I think, in activism.
Well, you see, Esther, you see on the screen, there's a portrait of Charles Schultz.
Yes.
Well, that's my drawing.
Okay.
So that's one way to slow down time, to bring warmth to the technological screen or anything we do, really. I think people who come up with amazing images, sometimes the one who transcend that older alchemical content of image that already pre-existed long ago. I think that's the way that we need to think about it, it's just the way that we've been thinking about, for example, I don't know, the movement that helped right after the printing press was made available in the mid, 15th century, we talk about Martin Luther, who was able to deploy that availability, technologically speaking, and spread out all that incredible knowledge base, a certain interpretation of the Bible that everybody can have a voice in it, their own interpretation. So it's not dictated by a certain singular voice, So I don't know. I think we need to work together, collaborate, and go horizontally with a certain mindfulness of it, But anyway, grateful that you came on. So this is going to be in our archive. We'll be putting out for everyone now who couldn't join today, so they will have a pleasure to listen later and learn more. But I'm serious. Let's just find a way to collaborate further. We admire what you guys do. So it's the beginning. And so thank you. Back to you, Eleanor.
Thanks again, Ted and Esther. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce Ted Rees, who is our Poet Laureate of the day, to conclude our afternoon. Ted Rees is a poet, essayist, and editor based in Philadelphia. He is the author of several books, including Dog Day Economy, Thanksgiving, a Poem, which was a finalist for Lambda Literary Award, and In Branson Fontanelle Flame. He has also published multiple chapbooks and essays. He's the editor-at-large for The Elephants, as well as founder and co-editor of Asterian Project, and Rees runs Overflowing Poetry Workshops and extra institutional online workshop space. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ted. I'm so excited to hear you read.
Thank you for having me. What a great talk. I remember being in college and looking at the Visual AIDS website for the first time in like 2007 or something like that, and being like, oh, yeah, like my people. Okay. So it's been nice to be here. I'm going to read from this chapter called Dear Hole, which is maybe after such a talk, it's kind of all about anal sex. And kind of my youth, my youthful exploits, so to speak. So I'll just read a couple poems from this, and thanks again for that wonderful conversation, Esther and Ted, and thanks for having me. So this one is called, kind of related to some of what you were talking about in terms of gentrification building up around people. This one is called The Condominium Development Built on My Semen. The sort of sex shop you wince at going in, if even to walk the stairs with a camera, squeezing trigger, thigh back, okay. Bleak palindrome or the eastern light leak in this rubber room or series of my throat wrapped around and dripping, capturing it dripping. All loose like spray, thumb circling bullock, boy me with a cherry in cheek, the linger. I imagine being consumed without feeding, but I'm lost. Pulsing my hands on his hips, how loose, I may say, how loose. Thus I plunged, enunciate, articulate, or never speak. I know it's false, but please graft here to ride, please here, and tighten his tit in my fist, fluorescent light, and then like water. Two more. It's big and it's gold. It wasn't a date we were on. The guy's face recalled eggplant, parm oozing his cheeks, eyes and ears and mouth and nose. I had forgotten yours, but the club was a cave, soiled in that way, leaning in soils so deftly, skin daring my sense, a running jump off the bridge, or at least suckle jugular news from you. Fingers inside my shorts, it gained. Young in an old man's tent, your righteous need to smoke after I reassembled the leopard down your hip and thigh. I never could wait to rip it off, and thus how I knew your season, to speak on the concourse of April, which is an attempt to fill every cup and every face I made for you, make for you, what you can't see, what your slug pressing my rose causes us, filaments in growing bulb. It was funny that, just to say that you mentioned going to seminary, and I realized reading this a couple weeks ago that there's a lot of language around like prayer and praise in this book, which is really interesting. Like kind of this, you know, this sacralization of the kind of the sex act or something. Anyway, this one is called Gute Laune, which it's, you know, a dumb joke, but good times. Centered, that is in repetition, of my neck bowed to crease into your visage somewhere between deaths, aloft, and slightly dumb, watching me like the glove I am, thwacking your belly at a Balearic beat. No sight of land, our song of praise. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ted. That was really, really wonderful. And thank you so much to Esther and Ted Kerr. It's been such an honor today. So grateful for the conversation we got to have. And thanks again to everyone for joining today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program to make conversations like this possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can check out on our YouTube channel. And for the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events, like our daily NSE. And this holiday season, please help us sustain our work by reaching our goal of raising $150,000 this month towards the Rail's writers, editors, and operations, which will help also keep our issues and events all free. You can donate via the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Leda Katunda and Suzanne Herrera-Lee Puma on the event of geography at Bordelon Gallery. We will conclude tomorrow with a poetry reading by Stella Wong. And now turn on the mics. Folks can say hello and goodbye as you head out. Thanks so much, everyone. It's been so wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Esther. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Esther.
Thanks, Ted.